I have dedicated my professional career to the study and control of arthropods.
Okay, so now I'm just going to finish up the section on sexual selection. Again, this was just an introduction to the concept. I'll get into some more details later on. Um, so, as I mentioned, Darwin defined sexual selection of having two very, very different components. Intersexual selection, which was selection between different sexes, meaning males are competing with females and vice versa for reproductive rights or reproductive aspects. While intrasexual selection was competition between members of the same sex, in the simplest form, male lions fighting for the pride is an example, or deer's budding horns or antlers. Now, what I think is really interesting, though, from a historical perspective, is that first of all, as I mentioned, science readily accepted Darwin's natural selection. It it was an idea whose time had come. Sexual selection, on the other hand, was people were fairly skeptical about it. To varying degrees. And one of the most outspoken critics of sexual selection, in fact, he came later on to deny that it existed at all. He actually completely denied sexual selection. Was Alfred Russel Wallace. If you're not familiar, he was the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection and one of Darwin's contemporaries, and they frequently exchanged letters. Wallace didn't believe in sexual selection. Now, at first, he believed in part. He believed in a kind of natural selection that Darwin called sexual selection. For example, male bighorn rams, that was one of the examples that Wallace used, butting their heads, in the mountains, mountain goats or whatever, mountain sheep, and then getting access to the females. That direct competition between males. But he saw it really just as not any different than natural selection, just natural selection that happened to specify one sex over the other. But intersexual selection, competition between the two sexes, Wallace outright rejected, said it didn't exist, and came up with some actually fairly and there's a whole series of exchanges between him and Darwin where he countered some of Darwin's examples pretty well, and Darwin recountered with better examples and such. I want to talk. This is a book here. I'll put the link up. If you can see this here, it's called "The Ant and the Peacock" by Helena Cronin. It's an incredible book, and this centers around the issues of natural and sexual selection, and deals a lot with conflict between Darwin and Wallace and some of their things. And she gives a very fair and balanced view of the different ideas. But one of the reasons why, and this is a prime example that Darwin used to illustrate intersexual selection, was he looked at mate choice. Okay, back to the peacock again. He looked at the fact that females were picking males based on the brightness of their colors, the big longness of their tails, the beauty of their song, even if the male that won the combat with another male, that females were ultimately choosing the male, such that he believed that females were selecting these male characteristics, if that makes sense. In other words, if you've had a whole bunch of proto-peacocks, some with a tail that long, some with a tail that long, and some with a full-length tail, and they're all mixed randomly in the population, Darwin believed that females, not males, but females, are mating only with those longer-tailed males, so females are driving sexual selection to the longer tail. That sounds logical, and nobody would have, most people wouldn't have a problem with this. And he compared it to another analogy that he used, is compared it to breeders. People breeding show animals will select for certain traits, and he stated that females in nature, likewise, will only mate with certain males that are carrying certain traits. And Wallace objected to that for a couple of different reasons. One, he didn't believe that outside of human beings that animals could really discern taste. Taste and not flavor. Taste as in aesthetics. He knew they could see color. He knew that, for example, one of the examples that Wallace gave is that a female can pick the colors to camouflage her nest correctly. But in terms of actual aesthetics, in terms of looking at and recognizing beauty in nature, beauty in another individual, that they don't have that. Only people can discern that. So only people find each other attractive. Animals just instinctively mate with whatever's available. And that's what he did. And he took it further. And this is when I discussed this in, it's called the instability of vicious female caprice. This is one of the things that Wallace used. And I read this in class, and it often turns, I usually lose some of my female audience become dedicated Wallace haters. He was actually kind of a shithead. I hate to be disrespectful. I mean, he was brilliant, and he did some incredible work, but some of the stuff he came up with just is, even for his time, was a little shocking. But anyway, he stated right here, "It is unlikely that all of the females of a species, or the great majority of them, over a wide area of country and for many successive generations, prefer exactly the same modification of color or ornament. And if female choice is not uniform, how can it produce uniform results?" Now that might sound harmless to you. The statement itself sounds harmless, but it goes into a whole, yes, product of his time, 19th century belief. But what he's getting at is that he makes a comparison earlier that even human females can't keep fashion sense for more than just a few years, meaning they can't decide what looks good more than a short time. So how could animals with even a less well-developed sense possibly select for something? Meaning that if female peacocks preferred a longer tail one year, they might prefer a shorter tail the next year. It'd be just randomized what they would prefer, because females, as a whole, are so indecisive and fickle. Does that make sense? That was Wallace's argument. I'm not making that argument, believe me. Okay. And so he denied this completely, and I think it's really interesting. So again, he denied it, but also more or less the majority of science opinion stood behind Wallace on this. It wasn't until the 1930s when we start getting into a lot more sophisticated, the genetical theory of natural selection, when we get into some more ideas on it. Sorry, I had a phone call there. I just want to take my last few minutes here, which is really quite short. I want to mention that now both aspects, intra and intersexual selection, are much better understood. And again, the discussion still goes on as to whether or not they are both totally or in part just another portion of natural selection and not separate altogether. And on that issue, I could care less about it. I could care less to me that's semantics. What do you want to call it? But anyway, the point is that now these have been further subdivided into multiple categories, and it really gets fascinating. So we start getting into things like we get the intersexual selection, intrasexual selection, competition between males. Now, again, as Darwin understood it, we can all see, bighorn sheep bashing their heads together, or stags fighting for control, or lions tearing each other apart for access to the pride. That's all really clear. I mean, that's something that we kind of all understand. We all can, conceive of that. But it gets the deeper concept in that is when you get into where males are actually competing on other levels too, more subtle social levels, more subtle gametic levels, things like sperm competition, things like sneaker males, these kinds of stuff. We get into really sophisticated, and the same is true with intersexual selection too. We get so much more is known about that. So I'm going to finish this section here, and I don't know if I'm going to have time to make another video today or not, but I'd sure like to get into some cool stuff. So, all right.